Dear colleagues and students, first of all, I would like to thank you very warmly for your invitation to this prestigious World Conference here at the normal University of Beijing, in a high place in the history of our field, the International Institute of Comparative Education. Because of the current restrictions in our mobility, unfortunately, I can only give my keynote in this virtual mode, but I am quite confident in the opportunity sooner than later to come again and to spend some time and to work with you here in Beijing. My gratitude goes to my colleagues there, especially to Professor Liu Baosun, whom I congratulate for the major contribution of his entire team and himself to the development of our field. And thank you again to those who accompanied me in the production of this short video. So my work deals with educational policies, and I'm interested in the evolving place and status of school and teachers in society from an international perspective. I am notably exploring in a comparative manner the forms and effects of the global spreading of educational policies and the way it challenges the modes of regulation of education, the curricula, and the national systems of education and training. These phenomena affect the research agenda of comparative education in many ways. I will try to illustrate this today in relation to the evolving nature of local conventions of education and schooling in two directions. First, the persistence in Europe, but of course beyond, of social and narrative conventions in terms of education provisions. The politics are always advancing in their action against the backdrop of a more or less stabilized convention, more or less consensual or conflictual in connection with local and crossed histories of our nations. This is what we recognize here with the sociological concept of regimes of justification, for which I will insist on their current crisis through a process of confusion and hybridation. Secondly, in order to comprehend these global trends, I will question the quasi-epidemiological dissemination of educational policies which are linked to the global imposition of watchwords in education, which reflect not only a hybridation of national education systems, but also the global imposition of one of these narratives regimes. First, what are we talking about when referring to narrative conventions and public regimes of justification? The trajectories of many educational systems suggest that the processes of expansion and structuration of education and the narratives that shaped this structuration are idiosyncratic, yet quite often very connected. Indeed, to justify choices in education for any society means being able, collectively, to justify how it is conceived as right and fair to distribute educational goods, and ultimately, it is also being able to justify the inequalities produced by education. As a matter of fact, if one society is unable to justify through a narrative what education produces, then inequalities are just unfair. The purpose of these narrative conventions is to ensure somehow that inequalities appear as fair, if I may say. Of course, no national system of education is a pure expression of one or another of these regimes alone. Rather, it results from a compromise between several regimes. Following sociologists Boltanski and Thévenot, and many researchers who were inspired in their study of education by their economies of worth, one can distinguish policy regimes of justification of inequalities. These regimes can be approached either as academic, or professional, or comprehensive, or even a latter one. at the least, a market-oriented regime. In the first one, the academic or meritocratic narrative convention, there is a competition between students based on their academic performances, in a competition that seems fair, legitimate, as long as it is based on selection, on individual merits. Merit, indeed, appears to be the bearer of a moral justification, coupled with a civic justification, according to Thévenot's expression in his pragmatic sociology. Meritocracy would thus be a preventive tool against the diversion of the common good by categories, castes, networks, markets. This is the egalitarian principle, which serves both a distributive and an academic conception of the education provision, and which is quite familiar to France as much as China, for sure. In its social and society foundations, meritocracy constitutes a sophisticated form of justification of inequalities based on strong public power and on an indisputable legitimacy of the state, which gives both meaning and to social structures and to institutions, including school. This political regime confers a central function to diplomas, to individual academic achievement in the regulation of education supply. It is therefore a conception that is distributive of educational goods rather than regulating differences in the accessibility to these goods. Another political regime of justification focuses on professional integration and continuously relies education, training, and employment. And this is very much a Germanic conception of education supply. Such a vocational regime enforces early tracking into either academic, technical, or vocational pathways for students at early age. This regime somehow challenges both the academic conception and the market-oriented conception of education, and it aspires somehow to promote equal opportunity and equal dignity in the variety of professional outcomes of education. A third regime, usually known as a Nordic social one, is comprehensive. Anchored historically indeed in Scandinavia, it is based on a principle of social solidarity and cooperation throughout students' school careers. Very much child-centered, individual-centered, curriculum-oriented, comprehensive and pragmatic. It is very much based on the construction of pathways adapted to the diversity of students' expectations, not only by adapting the rhythms, the forms of schooling in the diversity of students, but also by defying somehow the limits of academic knowledge, programmatic education, and school disciplines borders. Such a regime is aims at relying constantly knowledge and action, education and social cohesion, notably through a capacity to translate what is transmitted into social competencies. Then, last but not least, the market-oriented regime, which is more and more a dominant one worldwide. Indeed, the narrative of merit, for instance, in France, has been coexisted for years, not to say for decades, with the market-oriented regime without being fully assumed. In a country like France, but as in many countries, this is not really assumed because, contrary perhaps to what one may think spontaneously, such a market-oriented model offers its own moral regime of justification. For Thévenot, market constitutes in itself an order of moral justification, despite its basis upon individual interests and according to a specific figure of competition as a common good. In the market-oriented convention, added values in educational path will not come only from the diplomas, but from where they were obtained, in what schools, in what universities. And this goes, of course, with the concern of informed consumers. Predominant in Anglo-Saxon countries, it is spreading and adopted far beyond in the majority of developed countries on every continent. The free choice, the school competition are some of these keystones for such a market-oriented education regime. This regime is more and more structured, organized through networks associating public and private sectors, mobilizing new actors in the education arena, and promoting approach of training and education in more pragmatic and transformative terms. This market-oriented model therefore spills over from the countries that have promoted it in a movement of imposition, forcing the other models to quite acrobatic narrative adjustments. Thus, the development of education markets take various forms depending on national traditions and narrative conventions. Some are very specific and assumed, as in Netherlands, Germany, and of course UK, but in a very different manner. But in some others, as France, they are much more clandestine, unofficial, and unassumed education markets, and still very much vivid and at work through school choice and consumers' strategies. Then comes some trouble in hybrid model of education as ours. The dominant market-oriented regime challenges a lot, actually, the very nature of the public good which is attached to education, and thus it reshapes locally state forms of intervention and regulation in education. This contributes a lot to the fragilization of local social compromises in education. But what do these processes of hybridation mainly hold? My second point, I will shortly expose now, deals with this epic phenomenon, the epidemiological nature of current public policies of education. Those regimes, indeed, those narrative conventions we referred to as social configurations, seem to be more and more exposed, porous, under the influence of ideological dominations process of certain regimes, among others. This second point I would like to stress is how the epidemiological character of contemporary educational policies under economic influence, to put it straight, is readable in the political orientations carried out by the international organizations, such as OECD, European Commission, European Parliament, World Bank, etc. These policies express, obviously, an economic and political agenda, which is an agenda inspired by the theories of the human capital, which have been spreading worldwide for several decades. One of the consequences of such global dissemination is that in various forms, depending on the country, public action in education has been centered on the individual adaptation, his capital of educability, of achievement, through the educational form of the capital, namely the competencies. Global institutions played a major role in this move, and they have been advocating for a both individualistic, competitive, performative, and inclusive conception of education as a shift toward a more equitable education. Nonetheless, the theoretical or ethical debates and concerns that surround these topics, this reflects not only the global domination of one political paradigm, but also of one moral regime of justification of public action in education, which is mainly market-oriented. The irony of such a process of global dissemination is that even educational traditions marked by alternative narrative conventions, more societal than individualistic, more progressist than performative, integrate this global paradigm and deny it in the SAVE movement. If I insist on this, it is because it outlines the current situation of our educational systems, namely the persistence of narrative conventions in the regulation of education and accessibility to educational goods, but also their increasingly marked porosity with a market-oriented convention. Many educational systems, including ours, as far as I know, in Europe and in Asia, are quite emblematic of this alliance of meritocratic, academic, and market-based conventions. This state of development of our educational systems, and that will be my last remark, challenges the agenda of our field. These evolutions indeed question the task of comparative education, of comparative studies, of public educational policies. The contemporary context of growing hybridation of educational policies, the troubles occurring in their narrative coherence, invites to study the astonishing alliances produced by the contact of deeply historically rooted narrative conventions with more imported or circulating political lexicon as inclusion, personalization, professionalization, and the way they get along together with local long-standing narratives regarding matters of social cohesion of society. The transition to mass education has been a global phenomenon which concerned not only the internal inner dynamics of our educational systems, but it also challenged national regimes of truth, regimes of comprehension of education. I mean the local conceptions of education as a common good. That is one of these fascinating tasks for comparative education, to explore these processes of hybridation of public action and their effects on education and training, on educators and students.